She has no idea what she's signing away, my brother said to his attorney, loud enough for me to hear from across the conference table. He didn't even lower his voice. He wanted me to hear it. He wanted me to flinch. I didn't. I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and looked at the grain of the wood on the table. Mahogany. Expensive. My father had that table shipped from a furniture maker in North Carolina the year I was born. Funny how I was now sitting at it while my brother tried to carve me out of everything it represented. Have you ever had someone treat you like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected? Drop a yes in the comments. I want to know how many of us have sat in a room like this. Quiet on the outside, a hurricane on the inside. My brother's name is not important. What matters is what he did, and more importantly, what he didn't know I had already done. He sat across from me in a navy blazer he'd bought specifically for this meeting. I recognized the tag still creasing the back of the collar. He had his attorney beside him, a man named Cliff, who smelled like cigarettes and wore a tie that was slightly too short. And beside Cliff sat my brother's wife, who spent the entire first hour of that meeting checking her phone under the table like a teenager in homeroom. My side of the table was simpler. Me and one manila folder. That folder terrified them, they just didn't know it yet. Let me back up 18 months. Our father passed in March of the year before. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, which is about as cruel a timeline as the disease ever delivers. Dad was 64 years old, still ran 5 miles 3 times a week, still called me every Sunday morning to talk about absolutely nothing for 45 minutes, and then he was gone. He left behind a company he'd built over 30 years, a commercial landscaping business that now held 12 municipal contracts across 3 counties in Georgia. It wasn't glamorous. It was early mornings and dirt under your fingernails and a lot of years of not taking a salary so the employees could get paid on time. But it was worth something. According to the valuation his accountant had done the year prior, it was worth just under $4 million. He split it between us. 50-50, that was the will. His attorney read it aloud in an office that smelled like old carpet, and my brother's face went very still and very flat in a way I'd seen before. Once, when he didn't get a promotion he expected, and once when I beat him at chess at Christmas when we were 12. He didn't like losing. He especially didn't like losing to me. Here's what you need to understand about my brother and me. We are 4 years apart. He's older. And for most of our lives, that 4 years felt like a canyon. He got to do everything first. Drive first, date first, move out first. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that first also meant more authority, more inheritance, more say. Our father never agreed with that math. Dad believed in equal. But my brother had spent the better part of 3 decades quietly waiting for the moment he'd get to rewrite the equation. Our father's death handed him the opportunity. Within 6 weeks of the will being read, my brother filed a petition to contest it. He claimed Dad had been mentally diminished in his final months and had been unduly influenced, by me, specifically, to alter his original intentions. He said I had isolated our father, manipulated him, and convinced him to give me a share he had not previously intended. None of that was true, but the specific cruelty of it was that it was designed to be hard to disprove. How do you prove you didn't manipulate someone? How do you demonstrate the absence of influence? You can't exactly call a witness to testify to every Sunday morning phone call where we talked about the Braves lineup and whether sourdough was really worth the effort. My brother knew that. He'd thought it through. He also did something else. About 4 months after Dad passed, he started managing the business accounts directly. He told me it was temporary, just while the legal dispute was pending, just to keep things running. He said the operations team needed a single point of contact and it made sense for it to be him since he'd been more involved on the ground in the final years. I said okay. That was not me being foolish, that was me being strategic. Because I'd already talked to a forensic accountant. Her name is Dr. Okafor, and she is the most meticulous human being I have ever met in my life. She once caught a discrepancy of $11.40 in a client's quarterly report and traced it back to an error made by a part-time bookkeeper 3 years prior. She is not someone you want examining your financial records if those records have anything to hide. I hired her the week after my brother filed the petition. Quietly. Paid her out of my personal account. Told no one. And then I gave my brother the keys and I waited. It took him 4 months to start moving money. It wasn't obvious at first. That's the thing about people who consider themselves clever. They start subtle. Small transfers. Reclassifying expenses. Payroll adjustments that bumped up his own salary by 22% in the span of 8 weeks. Nothing that would ping an audit trigger on its own. But Dr. Okafor was watching everything in real time because I had given her read-only access to the accounts under the pretense of routine oversight documentation for the legal dispute. My brother never knew she was there. By month 8, he'd redirected a little over $200,000. Some of it went to a consulting firm that turned out to be an LLC registered in his wife's maiden name. Some of it was classified as equipment purchases. 3 of those equipment purchases coincided exactly with weekend charges at a resort in Amelia Island I found on the company card. I kept a copy of everything. I also didn't tell him I knew. I want you to understand the specific kind of patience that requires. I want you to understand what it is to sit across from someone at Thanksgiving dinner, watch him refill his wine glass and talk about the business like it is already entirely his, and say nothing. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you know that saying it too early costs you everything. I had learned that from our father. Dad used to say, "Don't shoot until you can see the whites of their eyes." He meant it literally once when he'd been talking about deer hunting. But the principle was the same. So I waited. The estate attorney, not my brother's guy Cliff, the original one our father had used for 30 years, finally scheduled the formal asset distribution meeting for a Thursday in November. That was the meeting with the mahogany table. That was the meeting my brother had dressed up for in his new blazer. That was the meeting he had spent months engineering. He had filed a second document with the court 3 weeks prior, a petition for a buyout provision, requesting that the court order me to sell my half of the company to him at a court-determined valuation. He argued that co-ownership was unworkable given our conflict, and that I lacked the operational experience to function as an equal partner. His attorney had attached a business assessment prepared by a consultant my brother had personally hired that valued the company at significantly under $2 million, conveniently cutting the value nearly in half, which meant my buyout number would be minimal. He sat down at that table, believing he was about to watch me either sign away my share for a fraction of what it was worth, or get court-ordered into a corner either way. He glanced at my manila folder when I set it down. "What's that?" he said. "Just some paperwork," I told him. His attorney started talking. He laid out the petition, walked through the consultant's valuation, and explained the proposed buyout figure, 43 cents on the dollar. That was what my brother believed my half of a $4 million business was worth. My brother watched me while Cliff talked. He was waiting for my reaction. He needed me to get upset. He needed me to argue or tear up or storm out, because any of those things would have confirmed his narrative, that I was emotional, irrational, incapable of managing a business. I looked at the table. I thought about my father refinishing it himself over a long weekend in 1987. He told me that story maybe 15 times. He always forgot he'd already told it, and I always let him tell it again. "Do you have anything to add?" the estate attorney asked, looking at me. "I do," I said, and I opened the folder. The first page was a printout of the LLC my sister-in-law had incorporated. Full registration documents, registered agent, date of formation, 8 months ago, 14 days after my brother had assumed full account access. My brother's face didn't change, but his left hand resting on the table curled into a loose fist. "I'm going to walk through something," I said, and I kept my voice even. Not because I'm angry, because the record should be clear. I placed the transfer logs in front of the estate attorney. Highlighted in yellow were 47 individual transactions over the course of 8 months, totaling $212,000. Cliff started to speak. "I'm not finished," I said pleasantly. I placed the equipment invoices next, each one flagged of the corresponding company card charge and the geographic location of the transaction. The resort in Amelia Island appeared 3 times. "The equipment listed on these invoices," I said, "does not appear in any company inventory. I had an independent operations auditor conduct a physical walkthrough of all 3 facilities last month. The serial numbers on the invoices do not correspond to any existing machinery. The invoices were fabricated. My brother pushed back slightly from the table. His wife put her phone face down. Cliff whispered something in my brother's ear. My brother shook his head once, a sharp, small motion. The estate attorney was reading. He was reading slowly, carefully, the way people read when they realize the document in their hands is significantly more important than they initially understood. "There's one more thing," I said. I placed the final page in front of the estate attorney. It was a letter from the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, dated 11 days prior, acknowledging receipt of my formal complaint and confirming that a preliminary review was underway. The room was very quiet. My brother found his voice. "She doctored those records," he said. He pointed at me across the table. "She has had access to those accounts. She set this up to make it look like You have not had access to those accounts," the estate attorney said, not looking up from the page. "The access logs show your credentials were the only ones used for account activity during this period. That was established in the original petition documents you yourself submitted to the court." That was the part that was almost elegant in a horrible way. My brother had spent months arguing in court that I was uninvolved in the business and had no operational access. He had used my absence as evidence of my incompetence. He had submitted sworn documentation proving that he alone controlled the accounts. He had accidentally built the prosecution's case for them. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since the meeting started. And I saw the moment he understood. Not just that he'd been caught, but that I had watched it happen. That every transfer, every fake invoice, every weekend at that resort had occurred while I already knew. "Why didn't you stop it?" he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost genuinely confused. "If you knew, why did you let it keep going?" I had been waiting for that question. "Because $200,000 is a civil dispute," I said. "It would have been a negotiated settlement, repayment plan, maybe a year of probation. You would have been back at the table inside of 18 months trying a different angle." I leaned forward just slightly. "I needed you to cross into wire fraud. I needed the transfers to cross state lines, which they did because your wife's LLC is registered in Delaware. I needed a pattern sufficient to constitute financial elder abuse against an estate, which kicks it to federal jurisdiction. That changes the sentencing guidelines considerably." My brother stared at me. "I also needed your consultant's fraudulent valuation on the record," I added, "because that's a separate count. You submitted a deliberately falsified business assessment to a probate court. That's perjury." Cliff stood up. "I need to advise my client to stop speaking." "That's probably wise," I agreed. But my brother wasn't done. He had one more move and I could see him reaching for it, could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed email chain. He slid it across the table. "She signed off on the operational changes," he said, his voice gaining a forced steadiness. "Look at the dates. She approved the budget reallocations. She's copied on every single one of these emails." The estate attorney looked at the printout, then he looked at me. I nodded slowly. Yes, I was copied on those emails. My brother's expression shifted towards something like relief. "I was also copied on them using an email address I stopped actively checking 11 months ago," I said. "I have documentation from my IT provider showing account activity logs. The address you corresponded with was not my primary account. It was a secondary address associated with the business that I had listed in the original company directory. I never responded to a single one of those emails, because I never received them in my primary inbox. You sent budget approvals to an address you knew I wasn't actively monitoring." I pulled out the final document in my folder. Activity logs from my email provider, certified and notarized, showing 0 logins to the secondary address during the entire period in question. "You needed a paper trail that showed my involvement," I said, "so you manufactured one, using an address you controlled the delivery to, because you were also the account administrator on the company email system." The estate attorney set down everything he'd been reading and took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. My brother's wife stood up. She picked up her bag. She said very quietly, I need some air. And she walked out of the conference room without looking at my brother once. That I had not anticipated, and I will admit that it hit me somewhere unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, something more like grief. Because she was going to have a very bad few years, and she hadn't been in that room by choice. She'd been brought there the same way I'd been brought into this fight, by proximity to someone who needed an audience. My brother sat very still. Cliff was making notes on a legal pad and had stopped making eye contact with anyone. "There's one more thing I want to address," I said. "The petition itself. The undue influence claim. The argument that I manipulated our father." I reached into my bag and removed a small bound document, about 40 pages. "This is a compilation of communication records," I said. "Text messages, emails, and phone logs between me and our father spanning the last 3 years of his life. It also includes a sworn affidavit from his primary care physician who saw him monthly for the last 18 months, attesting to his full cognitive capacity until the final 6 weeks. And it includes a statement from his estate attorney of 30 years confirming that the terms of the will reflect instructions given consistently over multiple meetings spanning a decade." I placed it in front of the estate attorney. "My father knew what he wanted," I said. "He always knew what he wanted. He just loved both of us enough not to say so out loud at the same time." My brother made a sound I hadn't heard from him since we were children. Something low and involuntary. Something that sounded almost like it was coming apart. I stood up. I smoothed my jacket the way I had watched him smooth his tie when he thought he had the upper hand. "I'm not going to ask you to repay the $200,000, I said. "The federal case will handle that. But I am going to ask you to withdraw the buyout petition, withdraw the undue influence claim, and sign a document acknowledging the original will as valid and enforceable. If you do that today, I will not pursue the civil suit separately. You'll still have criminal exposure, but I won't add to it." I slid the withdrawal document across the table. He looked at it for a long time. "You're really not going to let me keep anything?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Dad left you half," I said. "I'm offering you the chance to keep that half. The answer to your question is that I'm trying to let you keep everything he actually gave you. You're the one who decided that wasn't enough." He signed it. His hand was shaking and he signed it anyway, and I watched the pen move. And I thought about Sunday mornings and sourdough bread and a man who called every week just to hear my voice. And I did not let myself cry until I was in the elevator alone on the way down to the parking garage. The federal case is ongoing. I am not able to say more about it than that. What I can say is that I still run the business. I took over full operational control 8 months ago. We just secured a new contract with the County Parks Department, which was our father's dream account for 22 years. I am working on it with the same operations manager who worked alongside my father for 15 of those years. A man who knew Dad well enough to know exactly how he liked his coffee and exactly which decisions he never would have made. I still have the mahogany table. I kept it in the conference room. Sometimes when I sit at it for a meeting, I think about the fact that my brother thought he was going to take everything at that table. And I think about what my father used to say when someone underestimated him. He'd just smile. He'd say, "Let them." The company still bears his name on the letterhead. That part I will never change. What my brother never understood, what people like him never seemed to understand, is that the most dangerous person in the room is almost never the loudest one. It's the one who already knows the ending and has been quietly, patiently, deliberately writing it for 18 months while you practice your closing remarks in the mirror. I didn't win because I was smarter. I won because I was willing to wait, and because my father taught me that the most important thing you can do when someone tries to take what's yours is refuse to become unrecognizable in the process of fighting for it. Peace is not something you stumble into. It is something you build, deliberately, while everyone around you assumes you're too broken to pick up the tools. I still think about the moment my brother's hand shook when he signed that paper. Not with satisfaction, I want to be honest about that. With something closer to exhaustion. Because none of it had to happen. That's the part that sits with me when the conference room is empty and it's just me and that mahogany table and the particular quiet of a building after everyone else has gone home. My father used to say that how you respond when someone wrongs you tells you more about yourself than anything you'll ever do when things are going well. I didn't fully understand that until I was sitting across from my own brother watching him try to dismantle everything our father built, and realizing that my first instinct wasn't rage, it was clarity. That clarity, the ability to think straight when everything in you wants to react, is something I had to choose. Over and over again for 18 months. Every Sunday dinner. Every phone call where he talked about his company. Every time I bit down on what I knew and kept moving. That's not natural patience. That's a practice. It's something you build the same way you build anything worth having. Slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of moments where you almost quit. What I kept coming back to was this. I couldn't control what my brother did. I couldn't rewrite who he turned out to be, or undo the choices he made the moment our father's will was read. But I could control what I did with what I knew. I could choose to be someone my father would have recognized. Someone who fought without becoming unrecognizable in the fighting. Dr. Okafor told me once, about 4 months into her review of the accounts, that most people in my position would have confronted the situation immediately. She said the instinct to act fast feels like strength, but it usually costs you everything. Real strength, she said, is knowing the difference between a moment that calls for action and a moment that calls for stillness. I wrote that down. I still have it in my desk. I think about the people I've known who had every reason to fight, who were genuinely wronged, genuinely cheated, and who lost anyway. Not because they were wrong, but because they came into the room before they were ready, because they let anger set the timeline instead of strategy, because they confused being loud with being effective. My brother had more resources than me. He had Cliff. He had a fabricated valuation. He had 18 months of controlling the narrative inside our family. What he didn't have was the ability to wait. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. I'm not telling this story because I want anyone to admire how it ended. I'm telling it because I know there are people sitting in their own version of that conference room right now. Maybe not with a brother, maybe not over a business, but in some room where someone is trying to take something that belongs to them and betting that they won't fight back smartly enough to win. To those people, I want to say, the most important thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's timeline become yours. Do the work quietly. Build the record carefully. And when the moment comes, walk in ready. My father's name is on the letterhead. That part will never change.